Good evening and welcome to Poe Discussions with Jeanie and Carmen. And we are excited to welcome a very special guest who is joining us tonight for our interview. And then she will be also on our Poe Unplugged closer to the end of the month when we read King Pest. And so I am Carmen Bolden.
And I'm Jeanie Smith.
And we are the
Potastic
Two. We're getting better.
Come on, Carmen. You got to get with the program. Come on.
Well, every time we're not in the same room, and we say this every time, and it's kind of gotten old, the cliche. So, yes. But anyway, so our very special guest is Erin Adams, and she is the education director at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home here locally in Nashville, Tennessee. So, Erin, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me tonight.
Yes, thank you for joining us. So, Erin, if you'll just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Hermitage.
Yeah, thanks. I am Erin Adams. I'm the Director of Education at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. So my day-to-day mostly is with K-12 students, and it's with learners of all ages, really. I mean, we do a lot of lifelong learning type programs and various things. And so in addition to working with our education team, my department also is responsible for managing the guest services employees and kind of those functions. So everything that has to do with accessibility for the site, wheelchairs, whatever sort of, needs that a visitor has that they come with, it's my department's job to manage those needs as well. So it's a busy job, and not all of it involves history. A lot of it involves just logistics and visitor services and getting people oriented to their visit and just kind of staying on the right track while they're on site. So it's a fun job, and we've just completed a huge project to get our audio tour program reestablished on site. We lost it as a result of the pandemic, and so we have rewritten all new content, new devices, and new methods of employing the audio tour across the site. So that has been about a year in the making, and so I feel like I do a little bit of everything.
Sounds like it.
If I need to clean a bathroom, I mean, we have a custodial crew, but I can do that if that has to get done. So
right, yeah, you do what you have to do. And it sounds like I'm a current teacher teaching freshman English. Jeannie's a retired teacher, and so we totally understand. You just do what you got to do as an educator. Oh my goodness,
no doubt. No doubt.
Very much so. And one of the things that you were talking about is you deal with K through 12 plus the lifelong learning.
Yeah.
And I know that through the pandemic, you probably haven't had any field trips since, for those couple of years. But when you did have like field trips from local schools, where was it, just like the Metro Nashville area, or were you having them from different counties?
Yeah, we have, except for that last little bit of the end of the 2019-2020 school year, we were all going into quarantine for the remainder of that school year. We had nobody. But once schools kind of had the summer to figure out how they were going to roll out in the fall, we've had field trips ever since. So we're very thankful for that. Not all Metro Nashville. In fact, currently our leading school jurisdiction for field trip groups is Williamson County. Okay. So we have a lot of Williamson County field trips, but we see on average, we see students from, in Wilson County, they're tied, Williamson and Wilson County, here in Tennessee, right around Nashville. But we have on average every year we serve students from about 29 different states, and from about a third of the counties across Tennessee. We'll have students from them. Every year we'll have about students from about 6 different foreign countries that join us for a variety of programs in a variety of ways. Every year our education endeavors are a very multinational, international sort of crew of people, which is really cool. It's a really cool thing to be involved in.
Well, that's
Absolutely.
nice.
Yeah.
And one other thing I was going to ask is that when you are designing the programs for the Hermitage, I know you have, you're centering because you actually have Andrew Jackson's history right there at, you're part of your fingertips. But I know with especially the state of Tennessee having particular teaching standards we have to, abide by. Do you tweak your tours or your educational parts of it to match with some of the curriculum, or do you just have it centered directly on just the Hermitage and Andrew Jackson? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. We always make sure. You're right in that we are the Hermitage, so there is no other significant museum of. All
Mhm.
museums are significant. How
Yes.
do I want to say this? We are the largest museum dedicated to this, to telling the story of Andrew
Right.
Jackson and Jacksonian America.
Absolutely.
He has plenty of representation at the Library of Congress and the National Archives and the Smithsonian. But as far as a home place or just a museum that's dedicated to Jackson and Jacksonian America, we're it. And so our all of our work is meant to tell that story. Now, sometimes that story does not involve Jackson, or it does not involve Jackson as a direct participant, but he is a driving force of it in some way, right? He's the president of the United States, or he is the governor of Florida, or he is the master of the plantation. So there's a sort of a sense in which Jackson is always the driving force. But the story is not always about Jackson, which is pretty interesting. And we also look a lot at stories of Jacksonian America and how can we use the place of the Hermitage, the authentic place with the authentic collections, to be a microcosm, if you will, of understanding the Republic during that period, understanding what Jacksonian America is and why it has a name like Jacksonian America that isn't, there's not a Washington era, there's not a Lincoln era. So why do we have an era named for Andrew Jackson? So that's our goal, really. But certainly with all of our K-12 audiences, we do make sure that all of that fits the Tennessee's state standards in some way. We outline those for teachers. I mean, it would be senseless for us to try to do otherwise, because certainly you all are under so much scrutiny, to justify time out of a classroom, especially on the high school level, to justify your time out of the classroom, or bringing in somebody into your classroom, right, in a way that may not necessarily obviously lend itself to your daily scopes and sequences and how you get your curriculum taught. So we always make sure that our programs are aligned, but we do make sure too that we're conversing with the teachers in that way, and we'll make modifications as needed. So, for example, if you were to most of my examples are elementary related,
That's
because
okay. Oh, yeah.
fourth graders are taking, Tennessee history, or an American history rather. And so, a teacher may also be trying to fit in some economics curriculum that she's been working on. So she'll ask us to use terms like goods and services. Can we just, as we're talking about, say, cotton and cotton economy, the practice of slavery at the Hermitage, can we use terms like goods and services, right? So just to help reinforce her economics curriculum. Absolutely. Happy to do that. When we have groups that are coming from out of state, we try to make sure that we just have a few facts about the topic we've been asked to present, aligned with their state. So, for example, we teach a class at the high school level on the symbiosis of slavery and Indian removal. So where does slavery and the expansion of slavery directly intersect with westward expansion and the dispossession of indigenous peoples? We do that using a lot of maps and visual data. We use a lot of population growth figures. So if I've got a school group that's driving up, say, from Huntsville, Alabama for the day, and I'm teaching that program, then I'll take a minute to quickly orient myself to population figures in the same period in the state of Alabama, so that I can reflect back to them, hey, in your neck of the woods, here's what these numbers look like in Tennessee, but here's what's happening in your part of the world. We teach a class on Indian removal, and what we try to focus on is less about the Trail of Tears as a historic moment and more about the passing of the Indian Removal Act and where Jackson's unique relationship with that is in a way that other presidents don't have. So we try to do that, but I always try to make sure that if I'm teaching for students out of state, or really anywhere, when we're looking at how our senators vote on that act, when we look at how the House of Representatives is voting on that act, I can say, you live in Tennessee's 4th district, and here's the way that your representatives of the time would have voted on this issue. Or you're in New Jersey, I'm presenting this to you virtually. Here's what your senator was doing to try to stop Indian removal from happening. So that way, all history is local history in a way. Yeah. Jackson doesn't single-handedly affect Indian removal. And so let's put a little bit of that other area, into the story, so that people see themselves reflected back in the story of Jacksonian America. So it's a fascinating period of history, really fascinating. And certainly the president is always relevant because the presidency is always relevant. And so the actions that a president with very strong home ties to Tennessee has a tremendous amount of impact on people who live in New Jersey today, for example. So that's our way of trying to make sure that we're keeping those relevance connections really strong and really, really evident for teachers.
That's awesome, because I think sometimes that's the hardest thing, is to make those connections to the real world and to the modern world. And so that's fantastic. That really is great.
I would agree with that so much, Carmen. And history is a very practical tool with a very practical purpose, which is problem solving. And if you just look at it as the story of the past, and the past is gone and it's over, and then you're not even skimming the surface of what history has the power to be able to do. Absolutely. And I want students especially to understand that real clearly.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, you guys also do a book club that you guys have once a month. And so talk to us about that. I have joined a few times, and I have enjoyed it every time I've been on. I wish I could do it every month, but I've run out of time. So go ahead and tell us about that.
Yeah. So we have a virtual book club. We started it during the pandemic. I needed a new project to keep my mind fresh, and figured with everybody, mostly being at home or just separate from one another, let's just do it. So we call it Jackson's Library Card. And we started it with the sort of intention that we were going to try reading our way through Jackson's personal library, right? So what Jackson owns, we were going to try reading it. And we got maybe 2 books into that mindset and realized real fast that this is not going to work, because one, some of them are really not going to draw an audience. You'd have to be, everything has an audience, but you would have to be a political science nerd, at such extreme proportions to get any sort of enjoyment out of, what we were going to talk about. And some of it just frankly is not accessible. There are a lot of things in Jackson's library that are, some surprisingly so. For example, Jackson had a not first edition, I'm sorry. Well, he has a first American edition of Wieland, which was Charles Brockden Brown's very famous Gothic novel.
I joined you guys for that. Yes.
Yes. So, we realized that we had that book is easily accessible through most booksellers, your public libraries, LibriVox or Project Gutenberg, which are websites that do either free text or free audio recordings of books in the public domain. So there are a lot of it that's really easy to get a hold of, and then some of it just wouldn't be easy to get a hold of at all. And then the topics were usually so obscure that you wouldn't even want to try to go find it.
That's true. Yeah.
For example, there's a manual about tax codes in the United States in the 1830s. And not being a math person, and I can't even imagine that an accountant would want to know, the tax codes in the United States in the 1830s.
Yeah, you'd have to be a really economics, accounting, diehard nerd for that.
Or you'd have to be looking for something really specific, like either
Yes.
you'd have to be looking for something really specific. So,
Yeah.
so we decided to not follow that original track.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, what we decided to do is just make sure that we're keeping a solid balance of books, one that Jackson owned or the Jackson family owned, because we don't always know exactly who owned which exact book.
Mm-hmm.
So books that the Jacksons owned, as well as other period works that they may not have owned, but were certainly part of the popular culture of the time, or helped to build the national identity of the time, or that are, modern historical works, or works about, the period. So, for example, in November, we read Peter Cousins' new book, which just came out in April, but it's called A Brutal Reckoning. And it's about Jackson and the Creek War and the epic struggle for the American South. So that's clearly a secondary contemporary work for us, but it was a terrific read, and it shed a lot of light on Jackson and the Creek War. So we pick a variety of topics from a variety of sources. We've even tried poetry. We did the complete works of Emily Dickinson back in May, I think is when we did it, back in May. So only one time have I ever just picked an outright dud. But otherwise,
that's pretty good though.
Yeah. Well, and it was because I had listened to an interview of a book. It was called The History of the Orchid, or at least that's what I remembered the title being. Okay. It was The History of the Orchid. And they were talking about how in the 1830s, of course, during Jackson's presidency, Harvard and other universities and scientists around the world are locked in this like death struggle over who is going to be the world's premier orchidologist. Right. And like somebody is even murdered over the issue. Like it's, and there's a public debate about the morality of orchids, because orchids tend to look a little like female genitalia, and maybe we that.
Yeah.
And, so this was what I'd heard, and I thought, fantastic. This will be a great read for book club. Yeah. So I Googled History of the Orchid and picked the book and moved on. And then only to come to realize I picked a book called History of the Orchid, but it was not the one I had heard in the interview.
Oh, no.
And so we ended up reading just this like scientific treatise on the history of orchids.
Oh, wow.
Which was not what we were going for at all. But
that would probably have a different connotation on that book club meeting, because it'd be like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It was just not, it was very dry. It was very scientific.
Yeah.
And the readers in that month's book club were good sports, and they did it, but it was ultimately not the one that I had intended to choose. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first one I got to join was actually, I think during the pandemic, and it was for Halloween, and it was The Fall of the House of Usher. And we read that, and that was a great discussion, and really enjoyed it. And that's kind of got me hooked in, and came back for a couple more of them. Yeah. And it's been great. And so I always look to see what you guys are reading, and if I have time to fit it in. We've been very busy too lately. So
a public school teacher, I cannot even imagine.
I know. And then this is our side gig, I guess you could say. Well, did Jackson have any Edgar Allan Poe works in his collection or the family collection?
He does not, at least not that we have found. Okay. What's interesting about Jackson's books, or the Jackson's books, really is the better way to say it, is that there's not a complete inventory of the books before the 1890s and the early 20th century, because when Andrew Jackson III, who's the president's grandson, when he leaves the house in 1892, the house had already been, or the entire property had already been purchased by the state of Tennessee. It was already a museum at this point, but he and his family were living on the second floor of the mansion. They moved to Cincinnati. And when they moved, they just they divided up a lot of family stuff. Some of it they took with them, but then left it in storage for a long time. Some of it they just left behind. And at one point, Andrew Jackson III had taken all the bookcases and all the books with him.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he gave them back to the Ladies Hermitage Association that ran the museum, he just basically shipped the bookcases back full of books with no catalog of it. It was not clear at all, like who had owned these or when.
Okay.
So except for a few books that are either inscribed to Jackson, for example, Charles Brockton Brown's book Wieland was a gift to Jackson from the author's son. So unless it's inscribed to Jackson, it's a bit of a guess on the rest of them. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, because Jeanie and I were talking about it earlier, and we were anxious to hear what the answer would be. Because like with Wieland, you do have I think it's claimed to be the first really Gothic novel that came out. And so it's like, would Jackson have liked Poe if he didn't have anything in the collection? But with the King Pest aspect, would that have soured him of Poe?
Probably
I can
not.
I'm sorry, Jeanie. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say probably not, considering that during the teachings of the Jacksonian era and everything, and especially the growth of the Democratic Party because of Andrew Jackson and the growth of the political cartoon, I think that Jackson would have taken it with just the way he did with the political cartoon and enjoyed it so much, having to be the center of it, thinking, oh, wonderful, I love how you hate me,
Yeah.
Because that was the one thing that Jackson always would put off, was that, that's why many people, when I would have to explain to the kids why there was a donkey as the representative for the Democratic Party, and I would explain, we would go over the actual political cartoon, and I would explain it, and how, Andrew Jackson just felt, okay, you want to call me that? Then that's what we're going to be. And that's how the Democratic Party was like, now they are the donkeys. Well, because I can't say what they really, what they were really calling them in real, because of the classroom, but
Yes. You make a good point, Jeanie. Jackson is perverse enough to take a great deal of glee from his enemy's characterization of him, right? And he's just vain enough to enjoy it as well, I think. I think partly he would have been put off by his detractors, but at the same time, he also would have, he would have enjoyed a clever jab. That's one thing that a lot of people don't give Jackson nearly enough credit for, and that is his intellectual capacity. The man is brilliant. He is largely self-educated, although he has a roughly comparable to a sixth grade education, and not even just a sixth grade education. He has a classical education. So he had been learning Latin and Greek as a boy, in kind of the classical works. He was taught with the intent that he would eventually become a minister. So he had a more respectable education foundation than you might think from somebody, living in the backwoods of the Carolinas, on the eve of the Revolution. And Jackson continues to really seek out knowledge. He's got a solid turn of phrase. He quotes books occasionally. He throws a lot of classical allusions into his writings. He has a lot of he uses a lot of Shakespeare. I don't know how much Shakespeare he actually read, but at least he certainly held on to enough of at least the ways in which Shakespeare is in the common language, now, and a lot of these, expressions. But he certainly held on to them and rightfully recognized them as kind of the language of people in the know, So Jackson is incredibly well educated, very gifted mind, and he would have, if he had read King Pest, he would have it would not have taken him long to see, oh wait, the guy's talking about me.
And it's satire. It is satire.
Oh, Jackson knew satire.
Yeah.
He's not some like bumbling yokel who doesn't get it. He gets it. and is probably quite amused by it. At the same time, he's annoyed, but he's, kind of.
Yeah, Jeanie and I talk about a lot. It's like we wish we had a time machine to go back and, if Jackson had read it or, or heard about it, it's like it would be lovely to see what his expression would have been like in the room. And, we always do the what if scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, besides Whelan, were there any other Gothic collection of books or stories or anything like that in the collection? Yeah, it would be just kind of interesting to know, just to see, because like what you said is some of the books that are in the collection are very, like you said, the tax codes and things like that.
Right. By and large, the collection is nonfiction, as you would expect it to be. There's a couple of interesting trends, though. So let me kind of build up to this for just a second.
Okay.
So the book that Jackson apparently values the most in terms of, this is the one he recommends the most to his proteges to read, the one he kind of cites more often than really anything else, except for maybe the Bible, is a book by Jane Porter written in the 1790s, but it was called The Scottish Chiefs. And she's a British writer. She had a sister who was also a writer. The book is a novel. And it is largely about William Wallace and his and Braveheart, right? It's the uprising of the Scots against British rule. Jackson, more than any other book, is constantly putting that book in front of his proteges to say, and the young men that he sponsors and that he's or that he's a guardian for, to say, if you're looking for a classic example of strong, capable male Christian military leadership, you cannot do better than William Wallace. And he says this with some regularity. If you have read The Scottish Chiefs, and it was one of our book club books this year back in January, the book is a romantic novel. So it is a little art romantic novel, right? So it's, it's sort of a love story, right? Because, his wife is killed and so forth.
Yeah.
But that sort of dashing big speeches for king and country, let your loss be your lesson, right? This is what appeals to Jackson in a very profound way. In fact, in 1812, as we are gearing up for going back to war with Great Britain in June, this is March of 1812, Jackson has received orders from James Madison, then the president, to call up more volunteers to prepare the Tennessee militia to be essentially on standby if we go to war with Great Britain, be ready for it. And these orders that Jackson issues, because he was the major general of the Tennessee militia, so these orders that Jackson issues to the 2nd Division of the Tennessee militia is cribbed in a high degree from Jane Porter's novel. There's the first speech that Wallace gives after his wife has been killed. He kind of jumps up on this boulder and his followers are with him. And he's just, we're going to go, we're going to fight, we're going to revenge, we're going to get our freedom, and it's just this really impassioned speech that Wallace makes, and Jackson just about cribs all of that. And of course, it's Porter's writing. It's not Wallace's actual speech. So it's Porter's writing. So that is the book that seems to stand out the strongest in Jackson's imagination. And that's the one that we know he has read and read the most. There are several other books in the collection, though, that there's 2 novels by Charles Dickens. One is Oliver Twist. One is Nicholas Nickleby.
Okay.
But then, in addition to Oliver Twist, there is also a surprising amount of nonfiction work on poverty laws in Great Britain.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right? So is this meant to be? For Jackson, I feel like that's going to come from a lot of different places.
Yeah.
Oliver Twist is orphaned. Jackson is orphaned. And he's about the same age as Oliver Twist is in the story. So, and Jackson has to really carve out his own kind of life's path from a very young age. Does he recognize a fellow fellow compatriot in Oliver Twist, right? And as a result, then what do the social conditions around Oliver Twist do to shape Oliver's options, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so was Jackson just, I don't know, all of a sudden found himself more interested in, well, what is the situation of poverty in Great Britain? Is it as bad as it appears to be in Dickens' works? What does that mean? So I have all the questions about Jackson's reading habits, all of them.
Yes.
So there are novels. He has a couple of volumes of Tom Jones by Henry Fielding.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got a lot of that period work.
Mm-hmm.
He has more in the way of like travel logs. So, for example, he has Francis Trollope, who writes Domestic Manners of the Americans,
Mm-hmm.
which he does not approve of and thinks we're pretty contemptible people. He's got there is some Shakespeare. He's got Samuel Johnson's dictionary.
Oh, interesting.
But in amongst then all these like other pamphlets, newspapers, periodicals of the time too, that largely are talking about his efforts and either praising them or criticizing them.
Right.
There's a whole, there's a lot of congressional records of the United States. He's got a full set of Madison's papers, so there's a lot of what you'd expect to find in a library like Andrew Jackson's.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting, the things that I would interpret where they're strictly for Jackson's pleasure reading are interesting choices. Or there's some really interesting. Yeah.
It really sounds like it. And, and it kind of makes sense that he does have, papers and pamphlets and things like that. Because I think a lot of people forget that during that time frame, how much the pamphlets and the broadsides and the magazines were so prevalent. And that's where stories were, like several of Poe's stories were broken down into, this section of the story and then the next month, week, whatever. So that makes perfect sense that he'd have a very eclectic type of reading.
Lots of books of sermons.
Okay, well, and that kind of makes sense too with what you said of how he was kind of moving in that direction as a child. So,
and his wife was very religious. His daughter-in-law Sarah was especially later in life, but grew to be more and more religious over time. And so, but this is also the Second Great Awakening, right? We're in the period of the Great Awakening, and so having all that discussion of morality and spirituality, is really strong. When I first realized that we had a copy of Wieland, though, in the collection, I was a little horrified because I was an English major in college, and I remember reading Wieland and just like the book was trash. It was unreadable. Like I couldn't handle it. Right?
And I tried to like it.
I liked it so much more the second time around. I promise it was better the second time around. But in studying up for that book club, I did not realize that Charles Brockden Brown and Mary Shelley both have the same mentor, who is William Godwin. And so we had read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein the very first fall that we did book club. So we've also tried to build on some of those connections as well. That Brown is getting a lot of his inspiration and source material from Mary Shelley. And William Godwin. Charles Brockden Brown wants to write a book that Europeans are going to respect, but he wants to be American, and he wants to write it about America and American subjects, but he wants Europeans to want it too. Yeah. And so for all the books, it's not high-minded literature. It's, but it is what sort of breaks the ice is in terms of American letters, in terms of fictional works, right? Like, we had poets, we had, governmental theorists and others. But if we're going to have novelists, then it really took Brown to kind of crack open that.
Yeah, it definitely so. Yeah.
And also, like you were saying, during that time you had Mary Shelley and you had the other ones, and they were delving into the Gothic side of trying to write the perfect kind of scary story or ghost story, I think is what it was, that, they were having contests with each other to try to see who could write the best.
Right.
And
Right.
then also at the same time, you brought up the Second Great Awakening, but also this was also leading into the Reformation period, which I think would lead back to why Jackson was so centered on the nonfiction, because there was Reformation going on with the school systems, with the jails, the prisons. You had the Reformation of him trying to reform the business side of what the US at that moment was trying to recover from. We had the American Revolution, we were recovering the 1812 war. We were currently leading into the Battle of the Texas Independence, leading into the Mexican-American War. So there was all kinds of different pulls and pushes in the societal aspect of America at that moment that I think
Yeah.
Jackson was very much a part of, because not only just his religious background, but of who he was and where he came from and where he was at that moment, because having his military background and him seeing it from the different sides, I think is what
Yeah.
helped make him understand it and
Yeah.
want to strive to be. He could see the satire parts of it. He could take the hits, the lumps from him being criticized and all that, but at the same time, he could understand from a different aspect and put his own spin on things, I guess
Yeah.
is what I'm trying to say. So
Yeah.
it's good that whenever people see that Jackson wasn't just a name of history when they come to the Hermitage, that they get to experience that he was an actual person and had a family, and his family kind of helped build, because you said the library was, you couldn't pinpoint exactly other than what was written and dedicated directly to him as to what came and what went with the library, from whether it was his children, his grandchildren, or whatever.
Yeah.
And if there were more books in the library than what we received back from Andrew Jackson III,
Mm-hmm.
we don't necessarily have any records of those either.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's, from somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who was already known to be kind of a man of letters and a man of the idea, a man
Mm-hmm.
of the word. You can read his letters, and he's referencing plays, and he references
Oh,
novels,
yeah.
he references, all kinds of works of literature. Jackson doesn't. That's a very rare thing. And that's why I think the examples of the Scottish chiefs and William Wallace stands
Mm-hmm.
out so strongly to me when I'm reading his documents, because that's if there's a recurrent theme and kind of what he quotes and who and how, it's William Wallace.
Yeah.
And the Scottish chiefs. So I think you're right. And I think we also have to remember too that there is a great deal of source material for writers to work with, American writers to be working with in this period, because everything is not known about the continental North America, the continental United States.
Yeah.
You still have William Bartram, right, who's been traveling through the Southeast, writing about, the foliage and the flora and the fauna and the native peoples of Florida and Georgia and the Southeast. You've got Lewis and Clark that have just started publishing. In fact, it's Jackson's great nemesis, Nicholas Biddle, who's publishing the journals of Lewis and Clark.
Mm-hmm.
Other than little kind of bits along, the American public hasn't read, doesn't know everything that Lewis and Clark, discovered on their journeys. And so the United States, North America, still feels like this sort of vast and unknown and untapped wilderness, and anything is, I mean, in a sense, right? Anything is open for discovery. There's a wonderful treatment of the Salem witch trials in which Stacy Schiff, the author, kind of, her premise is to take these young girls at their word, right? That all the spectral things they believe are happening are really happening. And her point is to take them at their word and then to examine the conditions under which people would have found this believable and legitimate, And so when you think about animals that exist here that didn't exist in Europe, and what that means for the way they look after dark, the shadows they cast, the noises they make, whether they're prey or predators. You don't always know the flora, right? The plant life in the area, and then understanding, which of those plants are healthy and which are poisonous and which are good for agriculture and which are not. And, all of these unknowns are open way into the 19th century. It's
Absolutely.
we haven't mastered the natural world around us by Jackson's era too. So,
Yeah.
Washington Irving is a wonderful example of this, right? With the legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Mm.
The idea that, is it a headless horseman? Is there a force? Is there something magical about this bridge? And if you can just get over it, then the headless horseman is gone. Is it just a shadow? Was it an animal? I mean, what is happening?
Yeah.
That then Irving is able to take this source material and turn it into something, powerfully evocative for the reader's imagination. I mean, it's extraordinary, right? So,
yeah, it is.
And you partner that with things like John James Audubon publishing all these catalogs of botanical illustrations and bird illustrations, and these are things that, people from Europe haven't necessarily seen before. So it's, we have indigenous people that are still seen as these almost primitive yet otherworldly sort of creatures, this exotic sort of other that exists in the United States. And so all of these things just sort of are landing together at once in this really incredible period in history. No wonder Poe's making a creepy story out of it,
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I was
Yeah.
gonna say, and you mentioned the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. One of Poe's stories we just read not that long ago was Never Bet the Devil Your Head. And you can tell that Poe, I think, was influenced by the Legend of Sleepy Hollow based on some of the premise of the story. And we talked about that in on Poe Unplugged. And it's just very interesting how all these authors kind of connected with each other, in all their Gothic tales. But I love the point that you made that during the, early 1800s, really, really throughout the whole 19th century, that America was really figuring out who they were. And Jackson had a huge hand in that, coming in when he was president.
You pull up the map of the United States as we know it today. Well, you don't have to include Alaska and Hawaii for this purpose. For this purpose, but you pull up in your head a map of the continental United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And zero in your mind on the southern states, those 11 states that seceded to be the Confederate States of America.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that Jackson is not single-handedly, but Jackson is the leading force that acquires 2/3 of that entire territory for the United States?
That's huge.
2/3 of what is later the Confederate States of America comes from Jackson, or as a result of Jackson's efforts.
Yeah.
And if you think then too, what does that area contain? It has mountains, it has swamps, it has these incredibly diverse and well-established communities of Native people that are both assimilating into Western civilization and yet hold on to and practice some of their very long-standing traditions. You've got that. You've got cities as metropolitan and cosmopolitan as New Orleans, but then you've got these little tiny remote villages and hamlets that are up a holler somewhere, that are out on a bayou somewhere, or way up a river valley, that seem so disconnected from. You just kind of wonder how anybody landed there and said, "Yep, let's put here," So the amount of very high level sophistication, the very earthy sort of primitive cultures and primitive societies in some areas, with this melding of international cultures, which isn't just the British and the French and the Spanish and the Italian and the Germans and the Scots Irish, but it's also the Haitians and it's the Mexicans and it's the Spanish and it's people coming up from the West Indies and the Caribbean, and people of African descent. So it's this really intense melting pot that's bringing all of a world's worth of plants and foods and music and art and religious beliefs and practices. And it's an extraordinarily rich region in terms of its diversity. And Jackson is responsible for bringing about 2/3 of that into the United States.
Yeah.
I've been keeping a map on my desk where I'm coloring in, like every time I know more, like, okay, Jackson's on that land treaty, or Jackson,
that's neat.
So, it's just, and it's environment it's as profoundly different as the Everglades are from the Appalachians. It's just an incredible body of knowledge coming into the nation. At the same time, it's an incredible political game in the United States. And what do you do with all of that at one time?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeanie.
No, I was just going to add on to what you're saying, because a lot of it, and if you look at from the political standpoints of when America became America and who was leaders of that up until you get to Jackson, there's no way that you can imagine that John Quincy Adams or John Adams or even George Washington, even though he was a Virginia and area person, there's no way that they could have been that invested in the lower half in the lower southeast of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
But when you look at Jackson, part of Jackson's job before he ever got out of the military was he was a patroller between the Georgia and the Florida when the Spanish held Florida, and Georgia was just becoming like, building of its own, and Alabama and all that. So his, parts of his job in the military was patrolling these areas and seeing the bayous and the mountains. And he was, let's just say, he was more of a country boy, because where he was born in that little pocket in between the Carolinas before he ever before he ever got into Tennessee. So I think that's a lot of what people kind of miss, is that Jackson was in essence part of those states. I mean, he was a part of this.
Oh, yeah.
He was born, he was raised, he was groomed in this area. Whereas, if he had been born in Massachusetts or New York or somewhere like that, he would have never been able to accomplish even part of what he did.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a lot of the sectionalism that we always had to deal with, and especially what George Washington talked about in his inaugural, or not his inaugural, but his farewell address, is never allowing the sectionalism of the United States become a problem. Well, there's kind of a problem with that, because even when the U.S. was being created, there was a sectionalism happening. Between who was coming in, who was colonizing certain areas, who was, doing this, that, and the other. And even as we went out to the West with Manifest Destiny and everything, we already had a large influence of the Spanish that had already taken over that area. And even the Russians, people don't even realize that the Russians had a lot of, big parts on the left, because we have Alaska, and even all the way down to Oregon, and those areas had a lot of Russian influence.
Yeah.
So it just, I think the historical aspects of it, it's good that, at the Hermitage, yes, it is Jackson. It is a Jacksonian monument to who he was, but it's very much the Jacksonian era, which is a big portion, like you were saying, of what came about and put what states that were eventually a confederacy, but what put them on the map, so to speak.
Yeah.
And 2/3 of the time it's Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
And we could go parcel by parcel if you wanted to.
Oh yes, I mean the Achota Treaty, that kind of that he did break some rules, and yes, he should have probably been impeached for doing what he did by going against the Supreme Court with the whole the Georgia parts of that.
Yes.
But that's another aspect of it. That's just something else where we don't know what Jackson's true motive behind it was, other than, yes, he wanted to get that part of the land, but was it because of progress, or was it just greed, or was it just Jackson?
Right. And that's another thing too. And I absolutely understand why people respond this way. I really do. I
Mhm.
just wish they wouldn't. And that is,
Yeah.
it's Jackson is always so seemingly hot-headed. He's always so seemingly tempestuous that he's just kind of deciding what he's going to do and he does it. Jackson always has a reason for doing what he's doing, and whether you agree with the reason
Right.
or agree or disagree with the outcome and the way he goes about things, but
Mhm.
the reasons are rarely something most of us would find fault with. To be quite fair, so for
Yeah.
example, one of the reasons that he goes so hard against the Creek Nation in the Creek War is because his number one concern is that the Creek can become, they haven't done it yet, but they can become a tool of Great Britain. And in many
Hmm.
ways, Jackson is more concerned about the Creek, not because he hates them, not because he has any specific hatred towards the Creek, but because he is worried that they will become a tool in the hands of the British if he does not defeat them. And that's exactly what James Madison and James Monroe are worried about. So Jackson hardly comes up with this idea on his own. Um, Now, Jackson has all of the common held views about racism, racial hierarchy, kind of the rightness of things or the wrongness of things, or sort of the natural, and I'm using this in air quotes, the sort of the
Yeah.
natural order of things that exists, right? Jackson absolutely buys into that. And that does have, even if it's unconscious, it is the bias by which he operates. There's no doubt about that. But, we would agree, at least with the idea, that we don't want to be susceptible to the British. We don't want to go back to being British again. So if there is a tool that the British have got a hold of that could really dominate the United States, I think most of us, at least on just that very entry level idea, most of us would
Mhm.
agree with that. Yes, like no, we
Yeah.
don't want the British to have a particular tool that's going to, potentially put our independence at risk or our rights under the Constitution at risk. So we'd all agree with that in theory. It's how Jackson's going to go about it that you know that is going to be problematic. And so when people talk about Jackson sort of acting off the cuff this way or just acting out of sheer emotional forces, that is not accurate at all. Jackson is nothing if not strategically driven. Now, we won't always agree with his strategies, and we won't agree with the objectives, but there is always an objective, and there's a strategy behind it. So Jackson is absolutely doing what he intends to do, and he's doing it in a way that he has thoroughly thought through first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and that's the whole point that I was thinking of is whenever you think of Poe and him writing that story called King Pest, and it very much derives into that political candor that they were even drawing out Jackson as, looking like he was a king, having a scepter, because what
yeah.
he was doing when he got into office, where he was the favoritism kind of
Mhm.
thing. And I can't think of the actual term that they used in that time oh,
Mhm.
where he was putting,
Are you thinking of the spoils system?
yes,
I
thank
know
you.
it's been a long time.
It's, being 2 years out of the classroom, my mind is like, I know it, the spoil system, yes, where, that's the thing. And with the satire and with Poe, especially jumping on that bandwagon, because, he was nothing without having a Poe opinion about everything, because he hated the transcendentalists. So, and why wouldn't he treat Jackson the same way? Because, like you were saying, the societal norms of that day, mixing into the way Jackson thought. But many people forget that he had the mindset of, like, George Washington with that military strategy.
Mhm.
He was a very strategic thinker, and not a lot of people viewed that as being a good thing in certain aspects of it. I mean, we still see that today in the society norms, but Poe talking about King Pest, I mean, just the name itself automatically made me think of Andrew Jackson when I first heard it. So it's like, I wonder. No, I mean,
Oh,
because
funny.
Poe being a writer had to be influenced by the society of the time, so
Oh,
he
yeah.
wrote
And
about it.
he wrote like what we've said. Poe wrote what he knew. So
Well,
Exactly.
Poe, and I know we'll talk about that story a little bit more in depth later, but
yeah.
Yes.
Poe starts with, Poe starts by calling it an allegory straight out, right? Which should
Hmm.
be a signal to
Hmm.
a reader, like pay attention to all the details. But
Yeah.
I love that political cartoon, where King Andrew the First of veto
Mhm.
memory, born to command, had I been consulted, right? And he's standing in a copy of the Bill of Rights, just shredded to pieces.
Yes.
Yep.
I I just I think about the offensiveness of that image for for so many Americans, right? Of
Yeah.
Yep.
but yeah, calling him King Pest in the story,
Mhm.
it certainly does not portend anything good. Nothing
Oh,
good is
No.
going to come out of somebody by the name of King Pest,
yes. And
and
all the other pests that are
yes, Queen
aligned
Pest and Pestilence, and
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 a
Anna
pest.
Pest
Yeah.
and a Pest. So like nothing good is coming out of this,
No. Oh
for
no.
sure. So I look forward to talking about the story some
Oh
more. I
yeah.
think it's brilliantly done, and I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, oh, it definitely will. Well, I was going to say, speaking of Poe stories and poems, do you have a favorite? Like, is Poe one of your, authors you like? And it's okay if he's not one of the, your favorite. We love Poe, and we understand not everybody does, but
Poe is never my go-to.
okay,
I was an English major. I love American literature. I like it a lot better than English literature as a general rule.
me too.
My sister and I were very different in that way. I always wanted to read the American writers, and she always wanted Jane Austen. I mean, my favorite book is Jane Eyre, but otherwise like Hemingway and Faulkner. I mean, just all day.
Mhm. Oh
That's what
yeah.
I. Eugene O'Neill. Oh, but
Oh, amen. I'm sorry. You right there, you are now my, one of my peeps because Eugene O'Neill and I are,
Oh yeah. Jeannie
he's
does
like
love
my
him.
spirit.
Yes.
He's like my
Yes.
spirit animal in the afterlife. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I wrote a thesis on Eugene O'Neill, and I need to go back and probably reread some of his work because it's been so
Yeah.
long since I did.
Yeah.
But what Poe, I love how Poe has captured people's imagination. Poe to me always feels fresh.
Yeah.
Even if the language is definite, like with King Pest, I had to start reading it out loud just to kind of keep
Mhm.
myself on track.
Yeah.
So even with the complexity of the language and how little that is still in use today, kind of that high level of language, but it still captures the public imagination, and it should. Like that's a
Hmm.
best writer's work. Probably my one single favorite treatment of Poe is Sarah Jarosz's song Annabel Lee. She sets the poem to music, and I think it's brilliantly done. It's a beautiful song. I mean, it just kind of rips at your heart, because the poem is already so fraught with grief and
Right.
loss,
Yeah.
and to set that to music. And Sarah Jarosz, your listeners may recognize, but she sang with Nickel Creek for so long, and so
Okay.
she has such a beautiful style and such a talent for interpreting story through song. And so I love her treatment of Annabel Lee. I think it's just glorious. Um, I love the Mask of the Red Death. I
Yeah.
love it as a visual appeal. I love like picturing all these rooms of color, this party that's unfolding. What
Hmm.
happens when Red Death shows up? It's just extraordinary. And one thread I want to be looking at before we meet again to talk about
Yeah.
Pest is to look at the Black Death, but not. I want to look at epidemic disease and what the presence of this epidemic disease in this story implies for Jackson's time, because one common criticism that Jackson comes under during his presidency is that he refuses to declare a national day of like prayer and fasting when
Hmm.
there are these major waves of epidemic disease, and he's criticized for that, even though Jackson is religious. I mean, a religious person, but he
Mhm.
refuses because he says that is not the duty of the federal government, that separation of church and state. So I want to do a little looking kind of along that thread of thought, just to
Okay.
think if that's somehow a part of what Poe is trying to pick at.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating thing to discuss. And
Yeah.
yeah, our listeners and our group that will be meeting with us, they will definitely get into that, and definitely, yeah, that will be amazing.
Oh, okay. We'll take a look at that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Um yeah, so did like just like I think most of us, we find that, we're all introduced to Poe in like sixth, seventh, eighth grade. Did you kind of have the same experience?
Yeah, I think so. And you know what? I meant to pull it out, and I'm not going to worry about it right now. But
Okay.
I remember being on a trip with my family, and it was a trip where my dad had to be at work most of the time. So we're staying in the hotel, and across
Mm.
the street from the hotel where we were staying at was a secondhand bookstore. And we walked over there one day just to look around, and I was probably, yeah, fifth or sixth, seventh grade when this happened. And there was a beautiful book of photography where a photographer, inspired by the works of Edgar Allan Poe, went and took all kinds of really lovely, moody, atmospheric sorts of images and
Oh, neat.
graveyards and old architecture and forests and really cool
Mhm.
stuff. And then the book is called Visions of Poe, and so it was
Oh.
various works by Poe accompanied by these photographs.
Oh.
And so that book, just the visual impact of like those photographs, and then already knowing enough about Poe to know that he was, that a lot of his works were like that, very moody, very atmospheric, sometimes
Mhm.
pulling on the spectral or the supernatural. But I remember being really struck with Poe's poem Alone.
Yes.
Mm.
That poem to me, of of all the poems, if I had to pick a favorite, that's probably my favorite one.
Yeah.
Um,
What's interesting is we just did that on Poe Unplugged. That was the last thing we just read. Yeah, everybody loves
Really?
it.
Okay.
It's because
Yeah.
there's some autobiographical,
Yeah.
notes in there from Poe, and yeah, it's a beautiful poem. It's
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's something about being 12, 13, 14 years old and already recognizing that what's to come is going to be very different than your childhood.
Yeah.
Even for people that are growing up in happy, healthy, sound homes, it's just knowing that the future is going to involve things that you haven't necessarily involved before,
Um,
or you have already experienced them, and you recognize that this is life. Life involves these sorts of things, and you're forming so many thoughts about who you are and what the future is and where you're going to fit in that. And I think it's why 13-year-old girls like to read books like Twilight, because like
yeah.
or books by Dawn Green, right? Like where the heroine has cancer and she dies by the end of the novel. Like there's
Yeah.
something
Oh yeah.
that there's something about wrestling with those sorts of concepts at that age that
Yeah.
is common to life experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally agree. Jeannie, do you have can you think of any other questions that we've missed?
No, I think we pretty much covered it down to the get-go. I mean,
Yeah.
we have discussed that Poe probably being an American during that time when Jackson was president, he definitely had a probably different view of things, whereas and he interpreted it in his way. He was a writer. And so it would have been interesting to see if, being in that time period, if Poe actually got to interview Jackson and actually wrote something from just being one on one, because his satire about him from just the societal interpretation, I
Mhm.
just wonder how he would interpret actually meeting the man, because
Yeah.
we know Poe is very opinionated and Poe was not very
Yes.
liked himself. So
As a critic, yeah, his
yeah,
nickname was the Tomahawk.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it would just be interesting from that point of view. But
Yeah, it would.
to know that the Hermitage being around here in Nashville is great because you got that history right at your fingertips, and knowing it's a rounded Jacksonian democracy, not just just of talking about one person. It's talking about a lot,
Yeah.
and what it pushes. And this is the one thing we've always discussed with our 6 degrees is that Poe, like Jackson, is still influencing a lot in today's society, even though it may not be overt, but you can trail it back. Like
Yeah.
you were talking about, Erin, with how you keep marking down some of the influences of what, Jackson had with certain treaties, with the introduction of certain areas of the United States and all that. So it's kind of like you got the 6 degrees of Jackson in a political point of view with
Hmm.
geography and stuff, and then you've got the Poe side of the 6 degrees to where he's influencing, science and literature and all that kind of stuff. So in a way,
Yeah.
they are like, they are like in this time period of being two sides of a different coin, but kind
Yeah.
of being the same sides of the same coin,
Yeah.
with
That's,
their
you know,
future.
Jeannie, you're reading my thoughts because, it occurs to me, I mean, Jackson is the leading political figure of the day. Poe is
Hmm.
one of the leading artistic figures of the day.
Hmm.
Yep.
And writers are not that different from lawyers sometimes, and writers are
Yeah.
not that different from priests or judges, so there's they have both of these men have extremely long-reaching legacies,
Yeah.
Right.
extremely long-reaching legacies. You're talking about with Poe, you're talking about the artistic mindset, you're talking
Hmm.
about the use of language with Poe will never not be taught in high schools, right? From
Right.
that will never not happen.
Yeah.
Jackson will never not be taught. Fingers crossed. But
Yeah.
I think about Native peoples is the perfect example, right? But like Indigenous people, so much of what today governs the day-to-day life experiences of Native peoples in the United States today is absolutely traced back to Jackson. And I
Hmm.
mean that in a very practical way. We're talking about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of
Hmm.
Indian Education, the Indian Health Service. And then, I mean, the most recent time that the Indian Removal Act, which is of course what Jackson signed into law, was
Hmm.
used in the Supreme Court was this year.
Wow.
Yep.
Part of a lawyer's justification for a certain course of action in which Native people are on the losing end.
Yep.
That was Brackeen versus Holland earlier this year, and the court upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, but that was used as part of their argument. 3 years ago, in May of 2020, kind of right as we're all like obsessed with figuring out quarantine and the pandemic and all the rest of that, the
Hmm.
Supreme Court ruled in McGirt versus Oklahoma, in which they reasserted that it doesn't matter how old the treaties with Native nations are, until Congress creates a new treaty, the United States is bound to respect the treaties it has signed. And that is going to have profoundly strong consequences for law enforcement in the state of Oklahoma.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
And I
Yeah,
mean, and you could even trace it back even farther than that. Right before Jackson and before the Etchoda Treaty, you had, I think it was the Georgia versus Cherokee, I think it was, where the Supreme Court, that's when they first put in that the natives were a sovereignty of their own.
right. So
So,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
so it
yeah,
still comes back today and as will be because we still have those native pockets, those reservations with all these different tribes that know they're not as plentiful as they used to be, but they are still there. And in essence, unless the United States redraws and redoes the treaties, those are still law and they won't be
yeah.
changed.
Right. Even though those laws have been disregarded over time, that's part of what was so impressive
Mhm.
about McGirt versus Oklahoma is that the Supreme Court basically reminded the state of Oklahoma,
Yep.
no, you're a sovereign people and you're bound to respect that, which has not been the constant message of the United States towards its
Right.
native people. towards Native people. So yes, it is yes, both of these men, in terms of their long reaching consequence, I think as long as the United States is a nation, Poe, Jackson, and a few others, they definitely are, they will be relevant. And the last example I'll share, and then I'll be done, is, we have selected the phrase "home of the people's president" as the sort of subtitle, if you will, of Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. And when we first opted for that, I was fairly new to the Hermitage at the time, and I remember just immediately thinking, "Not my people." What did Jackson ever do for women? If I had been Native American, if I had been African American, like I can easily hear, somebody saying like hashtag "not my president" in those cases. But Jackson gets that nickname in his own time. And by using the nickname the people's president, what it lets us do is talk about, one, the changing nature of the people over time. Yep. And then it lets us know what is the relationship between the people and the president, and when should that change, and under what terms should that change? What happens during Jackson's administration that it introduces new ideas to the people that, hey, all of a sudden the people feel empowered to bend Congress their direction, right? All of a sudden Jackson is setting up this idea that the executive officer answers to the citizens of the United States, not Congress, right? So it empowers the citizenry of the United States. And as more people clamor for citizenship and want the full rights and full responsibilities of citizenship, they are the people, right? And so it is a phenomenal way of understanding the relationship of the executive to the citizenry of the United States. And I think Edgar Allan Poe can be very much an extension of that concept. He's not the people's president, but maybe he's the people's writer,
Yes, I agree.
So if somebody were called the people's writer, what would that mean for us today? Not just the people that were, his peers and his, contemporaries. What does that mean for me and you? How does his language still produce these new thoughts or these inspirational ideas, or how does it challenge us in our use of language and our knowledge of language, or our ability to harness language to express some really powerful concepts? So if Jackson's the people's president, maybe Poe is the people's writer.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely love that.
And it makes perfect sense, because if you think about it, when you think of writers and people who like reading, especially older classics from time periods, especially around that area, yeah, Mark Twain will come to mind, but Mark Twain will have a different connotation.
Yeah.
And then you also have other people's that come into play there. You have Agatha Christie, you have, those, they're not Americans. You have Hemingway. I mean, I like Hemingway, okay, but I'm not a fan of Hemingway. He has, he's a great writer and all that kind of stuff, but think about it. Anybody you ask, if you mention the name Edgar Allan Poe, somebody is going to either say, "Oh, the Raven," or "Oh, Annabel Lee," or because somebody has been influenced or touched one way or the other by something he has written, and knows Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah. And that's one reason we always ask everybody, what is your favorite story or poem, and kind of how did you first come about Poe? It's just very interesting, all the different stories and influences.
Oh, I believe it. And I think, Poe is so much, it's still in public imagination and pop culture. So I recently, my best friend is married, and I got her husband a coffee mug that said, "I'm a Poe, I'm just a Poe boy from a Poe family."
Yes.
It says Edgar Allan Poe, but of course it's the lyrics from Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody.
Right.
So it's melding these two very powerful pop culture forces in a way that, most people just immediately connect to, like, oh, that's clever. Like, it's Poe, but it's Queen, and it's, and we're all loving that kind of play like that. So when people have read Poe, they certainly recognize him from pop culture. People recognize Jackson from the currency, the pop culture, the criticisms of Jackson, whether they know much about him or not, he's recognizable to them. And so, Poe is very much so, as a point of cultural literacy, if you will. Poe is indispensable, and I think Jackson is in the right company in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Jackson actually has a song that he's in a song, the Battle of New Orleans. I mean, that's one of
Yes.
his, that's one of his most famous, before he became president, everybody, I mean, the Battle of New Orleans by Johnny Horton, it's like, so it once more, like you said, there's always going to be little bits and pieces, but pop culture, whether it be, mathematics, scientific, political, literature, whatever, something about these two men and the era of time that they were in has reached across these many generations and is still going forward.
Yeah. And I think it will continue forevermore. Not nevermore, forevermore.
Exactly. So, but
very
yes,
good,
so
very good. Yes.
So our Poe Unplugged, like we've been talking about, is going to be at the end of this month.
Yes.
I don't know the date, Carmen.
I'm looking it up because for whatever reason, I have my mind, I think, is tired. Let's see, we're about to go into our Thanksgiving break, so it's always busy. Yeah, November 28th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Check our website, 6degreesofpoe.com for anybody who's listening, and register, and we'll send you the Zoom link the morning of the event. And just read King Pest and be ready to talk about it. And Erin's going to give us a lot of cool things about Jackson with it.
Yes. And we're going to look forward to that. And she's going to be joining us.
At least it's short.
Yes.
Complex, at least it's short.
Well, and what's cool, because, Poe wrote, he only had one novel, and he's written some other things, his Science of Eureka, which was longer, and his textbook on seashells. But with him kind of pioneering the short story, we've kind of credited him in a loose way that, he kind of created like the 1 hour drama and, half-hour sitcom, because he said that a story the best type of stories are the ones that you can sit down and for a very short time read over and you're done. And you've had, a really enjoyable hour of time reading a story. And so it's just kind of cool to think about all the influences.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Erin, anything else you want to add?
No, except, always, as if people are interested in reading more about this period, certainly check out our virtual book club. It's called Jackson's Library Card, but you can find all the information on the Hermitage's website. And December's book is going to be a hefty read. It's Frederick Law Olmsted's book called The Cotton Kingdom, kind of looking at the status of cotton agriculture in the South prior to the Civil War, which we don't normally associate with Frederick Law Olmsted, but it's going to be a great read. I'm really looking forward to it. So.
Oh, cool.
And you can also download off our website. You can download a PDF it's a spreadsheet that's got all of the books we've ever read since we started this.
Nice. Okay.
You can see every book that we've read for our book club if you're interested in reading. And the book club is open to readers ages 16 and up.
Okay.
Sometimes we get high schoolers who want to, they're reading the same work in class and they want to join a conversation about it. And that's perfectly fine, but it is mostly adults. And so we just want to make sure we've got, people who can manage themselves in that situation.
Absolutely.
It's been a terrific group of people and a respectful group of people. And it's just been the joy of the last few years. So we've had a good time.
Yeah, it's great. I highly recommend it. I just wish I could do more than I do. I just need to make time for it. And then also, if you are in the Nashville area, definitely go take a tour of the Hermitage. And they have all kinds of events. Right around the time that Charles Wissinger came and did his Poe event there, I became a member. And so I've got to take advantage of the membership because, yes. So, because we don't live that far. We live like, what, Jeanie, is it probably like, Jeff and I live, 20 minutes away, if that?
About
20-ish.
25.
Yeah, about 25 minutes. So, because we're just in Mount Juliet. So, yeah.
Well, and we're always just like 5 miles from the Nashville airport. So anybody traveling this way, we're a very
Yes.
convenient. We're a very convenient stop, either as you're just coming into Nashville or about to head back out again. So
Absolutely. And the grounds are beautiful. It is just an absolutely beautiful place.
I think so too.
So,
Very well kept. It's very nice.
yes. Well, Erin, thank you so much for being our guest tonight. This has been an awesome conversation. I have learned a lot.
Me too. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and Jeanie, are we ready?
Yep, we're ready. Are you ready?
Yes.
We are.
Poe